Welcome to the Saturday Cup of Joe, week 249 in Detroit. Got my cup of Joe here. This week I had some quotes come across my desk in my reading or listening to podcasts, and I started to make a list of these quotes, and I found that 4 or 5 quotes throughout the week kind of landed, and I thought that was interesting. And then some of those quotes seemed to match up to some articles I was considering for the Cup of Joe, and so I thought, all right, I'll match a quote that I heard this week to an article I saw. So this might be a little bit all over the place, but a couple different topics. But I think they all have a weird relationship and they kind of fit together. So we'll see if you agree. The first one was from a podcast. I've been listening to the Tim Ferriss podcast probably longer than I've been writing the Cup of Joe. And a friend of mine, Scott, who works in innovation around property valuation um, and he and I have been talking about this interview between Tim Ferriss and Mark Randolph, the co-founder of Netflix. And Mark said in the podcast, there are no good ideas. All ideas are bad ideas. And I really like that. What he meant by that was that an idea is just an idea until it's put in the world and you see whether it works or not. So not letting yourself get too caught up or compelled into the idea itself. And I've written before about how you can't rely on the idea alone. It has to be the communication strategy and the execution that make all the difference. And his thought was very similar, which is all ideas are bad ideas until you put them in the world. And then you see whether it's a good idea or not. And, you know, in some ways, the article that came around, I think probably in the last 24 hours, I bet you've been emailed it or texted it or pointed to it on social media, and that was the Wall Street Journal article about this group of people that rushed out to buy a house during the pandemic only to regret it, and a bunch of stories about how they regretted home ownership because this went wrong or that went wrong or what have you. But to me, it was partially because they started with the wrong idea. I've been saying for a while that as much as home ownership can be a wealth creation vehicle, and as much as I believe homeownership does stabilize communities and stabilize families, certainly we know housing overall, housing stability is a cornerstone of all types of other kinds of stability and progress. But homeownership in particular is much more the emotional decision to commit to a place, and it's going to come with cost. It's going to come with all the headaches we all joke about. Anybody who owns a home will tell you that. And it's not financially that much fun, especially in the first few years, especially with an older house, which many in America are older homes. And so I would say that many of the folks in this article who went out and bought houses during the pandemic got exactly what they intended to get, which was they just wanted to get out of the city. I just need to be out of Brooklyn. I just need to be out of San Francisco. I'll just buy a house. In that case, you're not really, your strategy is not really planning for a turnkey investment that you don't have to do anything with. Your goal was to buy a house to get more space and get out of a city. You achieved that. You achieved your goal. The fact that there was woodpeckers eating the side of the house and creating uh, irreparable damage to the side of your house in that neighborhood was more a factor that would have come into play if the strategy was buy a house to get out of the city and have it not need any other considerations or not need any other repairs. So to me, the idea of home ownership needs to start to evolve much more around place and a bigger concept of life, your life plan and what you're trying to achieve, and I think less about the financial future of your family or your place. And so when you get this article or you see this article, obviously I'll link to it, but consider what the strategy was set out to do versus what it did and how we can think about incorporating more economic stability, economic development of a community and really that personal story you're trying to tell into our concepts of homeownership in the American dream and leave behind this notion of the appreciation of the home over 30 years. Will that happen? Yes. Is homeownership fundamental to wealth creation? Yes. Have many communities, especially communities of color, been boxed out of homeownership and as a result, net worth and wealth creation has actually trailed significantly in communities of color, especially Black Americans? Yes. So we can still talk about wealth creation. We can still talk about economic growth, economic progress, but the homeownership experience itself is going to be an entirely emotional one based on the parameters you set out to achieve. And that kind of leads me into a second category, which is how do we create more homes? How do we create more stability? How do we create more opportunities and lower those barriers that, if you read or listen to the Cup of Joe, that, I've been working on closing the gap between Black Americans and white Americans in homeownership, closing the gap between communities of color and white Americans in homeownership. And one of the things that I keep coming back to is supply. You know, the number has gone down a little bit. When I first started working in housing policy, it was 11 million units. The most recent estimate I thought was between 7 and 8 million units deficient that we need to kind of reach what everyone would call equilibrium in housing affordability. But the reality is it's a multi-trillion-dollar deficit in an asset class. And you know, Dr. Raphael Bostic is the president and CEO of the Atlanta Federal Reserve Bank. And his comment was everyone well housed. That if you're in mortgage, if you're in real estate, if you're in housing, the idea should be that across the spectrum, everyone is well housed because that's when it works. That's the entire economic development and community development I've been talking about. One way to get there is this idea of, you know, modular housing or productizing the home. And there's a great video which I'll link to that it is a bit long, but 10 minutes or so, but it kind of goes through how you can create an assembly line and build a house like you'd build a car, and then assemble the supply chain and installation very similar to how you'd ship a product. One of my favorite companies in this space is Connect Homes. Been working with them and really, really see a lot of potential there. But one that's featured in the video is Factory OS. Um, but I think the quote that I would highlight here is from the experience of an MIT professor who kind of boiled down all of his lectures and all of his, speaking experience and teaching experience into lessons. And one of the lessons was that every lecture needs to state a main point, repeat it over and over like a theme with different variations, and then move the audience slowly in the direction that they're trying to go. I feel in housing like the lecture is supply and moving everyone towards new methods of construction and new ways of creating supply chains in housing needs to open our minds beyond traditional stick-built constructed homes and think of a variety of different ways to disrupt and create new innovation in housing. And modular is one of them. And it's one that seems to have a lot of momentum and potential. So, one of the things I'll be thinking a lot about this week is that. Also, we've seen the we've seen housing pop up in two other ways in the confirmation of Secretary Fudge to HUD and in the demographics I was talking about earlier, people moving around the country, moving to the Midwest, moving away from the coast. The one quote that came across my desk from Jeff Bezos this week was if you absolutely can't tolerate critics, then don't do anything new or interesting. And of course, the Cup of Joe is all about new and interesting. It's all about innovation. And so, not only do I have to be okay tolerating critics, I think that that goes to some of the disruption you'll see in this article. It's a Bloomberg profile of Secretary Fudge and what challenges she's facing in housing, but also what disruption she hopes to bring to housing. And I was on a call this week, did a Zoom call with my high school friends, some of my dearest and closest friends, some of whom within that group we've been friends since kindergarten, since before kindergarten, in a couple of cases, 3 years old. And my friend Adam said to me, you always talk about answer well. I feel like you're really good at the listen well part, taking in information from a variety of different sources, listening to things that you disagree with, seeking out things you may believe you disagree with and listening to them. But I think that that's a great lead in to this. If you can't tolerate critics, don't do anything new or interesting. Secretary Fudge is talking about some really new concepts of housing equality, and I think that they deserve attention. And it should make us think differently about everyone well housed. It should make us think differently about housing. And so I'll link to her perspective and her experience. She comes to HUD with 20 years of experience in housing, which is, or excuse me, a career of experience in housing, which is more experience than the last 20 years of HUD executives, of HUD leadership. So, meaning the political appointees at the top. And so it'll be very interesting, to follow her in that role. The other quote was actually Elon Musk. There's a new social platform, if you are not familiar with it, it's called Clubhouse. It's an audio platform. You can drop into a room that's been created and just hear the conversation going on in real time. So instead of video, it's audio. And instead of a podcast being recorded, it's live. And once it's gone, it's gone. It's this live, it's almost like dropping into a conference call. But because it's open, you can hear Elon Musk talking to Mark Andreessen. And one thing that Musk was asked in one of these clubhouse rooms was, "What words of encouragement do you have for entrepreneurs?" And his response was, "If you need words of encouragement, don't become an entrepreneur." And I think that's well said. And it kind of took me back to this concept of next belt, which is why, one of the ways I started the Saturday Cup of Joe was rebranding Detroit and rebranding the Rust Belt, because I felt like every article about Detroit or Cleveland or Cincinnati or Pittsburgh or Milwaukee would either say the Rust Belt or the former Rust Belt, still getting it in there, right? And I branded it the next belt. Well, in Housing Wire this week, we saw that home values in Detroit, St. Louis, Milwaukee, Columbus, Cincinnati all went up, and in some cases in double digits. These metro areas are seeing growth of 10, 12, 15% in home values because people are coming to the Midwest. And I've written before about tech talent. I've written before about being an entrepreneur in Detroit and how you can access the coasts and access the digital infrastructure. You don't need to be in Silicon Valley. You don't need to be in Brooklyn. And we're seeing that in some cases. So you don't need words of encouragement, to move to Detroit and move the world, to move wherever you want and change the world. Because you can think about that as an entrepreneurial move. Whether you're starting a company in Detroit or just buying a house, you're the entrepreneur of your life story. And if you need words of encouragement from others, you're going to be continually searching for that. But if you want to uh, be an entrepreneur in your life story, and the Midwest is part of that, you won't need encouragement from me, and you won't need encouragement from anyone. You'll just follow, building your story like building a company. And so I'll link to the sort of good news about the next belt here. And then the other thing I'll link to is just, Ryan Holiday, one of my favorite authors. The book Ego is the Enemy definitely impacted my worldview and thought. And Ryan is a modern philosopher of sorts, reviving the Stoics, reviving Marcus Aurelius and Seneca and others in the way he thinks about the world and the way he approaches the world. And so I just wanted to link to, this idea that he had this week of fight to be the person philosophy wants you to be. And you could think about that as religion. If you're practicing in faith, then fight to be the person that your faith wants you to be. He talks about how Marcus Aurelius is modest and straightforward and sane and cooperative. And those reasonable traits typically don't generate a lot of energy or activity in our culture and our media, especially because they're so moderated and they're so reasonable that they're tough to get excited about. But I think it's becoming radical to be modest, straightforward, sane, and cooperative. And Ryan actually adds a couple more Stoic values on top of Marcus Aurelius and says that includes courage and justice and temperance and wisdom. And if you're a Christian, these things all kind of flow. You could recognize the themes from Proverbs, you can recognize the themes from the Bible as well. And I have more familiarity with those, but the other religious faiths, these philosophies, in my opinion, it is nice to return to that concept of who do you want to be? Who does your philosophy want you to be? And how are you doing that? And so, whether it's answer well, or as Adam said, listen well. I hope this week has been one that has given you some encouragement. And I hope this Saturday Cup of Joe gives you some encouragement to think differently about some of these problems, to challenge what are the tough things about innovation or entrepreneurship or housing or fair or equitable outcomes and justice in different sections of our society. And so have a great week and look forward to talking to you soon.